Hi, welcome to Conversations podcast, everyone. Today we have a very esteemed guest who I have been chasing for I think over a year and a half now. Last
Yeah,
time we wanted to get you on the Walkable Cities conclave, but we couldn't
yeah.
make it because of some issue. But
It was fractured, I remember.
yeah,
In that same week where it was supposed to. Yeah, I know.
yeah, literally. But yeah, so we have Rohit Lahoti, urban development practitioner, and he has a lot of experience over a decade almost into multiple fields within Mumbai. He has worked with informal economy, housing, right now with street vending, and he has. I have been wanting to get him on our podcast ever since I had seen his first presentation at one of the events that I've been to, and I think that it is extremely important that this conversation is had and this conversation is in the public domain, because like this is the number one topic that people are mad about in each and every of our engagement with the people, like be it community walks, be it community talks, presentations, government official meets, at every location. If we say ki we need better footpaths, we need better walkability in our city, immediately the question is ki, like what about hawkers? Aren't hawkers just gonna come over and take over the entire space and all? And there is a very clear lack of understanding that people have, I feel, and also a huge lack of empathy, to be very honest, when generally it comes to street vending in the city. And I really look forward to the conversation we have over the next hour and touch upon a few things. Really welcome to
Thanks,
Working Project
thanks.
Conversations, Rohit.
Thanks for inviting.
Yeah,
Exciting topic and a complicated one.
very exciting and complicated. I just
Mm.
want you to set the tone by just telling about yourselves, like why street vending is something you chose to research, and like just tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so I think so. I'm an architect by profession, but then, yeah, I mean, my interest has been in the urban development space ever since my formative years in architecture. And I think street vending as a topic, something uh, I think it kind of came to me uh, during my work. So when I was working as a consultant, and it was with the state government, with the urban development department, and I was leading one of the big implementation schemes, a central government scheme about which was PM Swanidhi, and it was about giving loans, subsidized loans to street vendors. And I think that was one of the sort of that entry points where I started really deep diving into understanding street vending as a subject, also from the legal standpoint. That are there any existing laws that prevent? Because before that, of course, I knew that there is something called as Street Vendors Act, and there is an official term called street vendors. So then it always, when I went on ground at different points, even before my work experience with this subject, but also during exploration in different cities while traveling, I always realized that they contribute so much to the informal economy. And I think most of our Indian cities run on informal economy. Then why is there a constant negotiation on the street where they are not considered as equal stakeholders, right? And I think that was there, but of course, sometimes you think about it, but then you really don't deep dive into it from a regulatory and legal standpoint. But my work allowed me to also foray into that, and that allowed me to kind of read about the Street Vendors Act, how it has been uh, taken up in Maharashtra, when was the street vending scheme came up, when the rules came up, etc. And I think that led me to really think and question about in what way can they be considered as equal stakeholders, and what are the existing regulatory mechanisms that prevent them. But at the same time, because of the lack of implementation, because of various reasons, there is always that debate that whom should the streets be for. And often many people who fight for pedestrian rights, they often don't even know that there is something called a Street Vendors Act, and they are not so called encroachers, but they are the rightful occupants of the street as much as the pedestrian or the shopkeepers, or the floating visitors whom we talk about. And of course, now parking. is the big thing, which I'm sure walking project always cannot talk about street without parking, right? So I think
Yeah.
a lot of these multiple factors, and I had some great mentorship. One of the definite like mentors, like because of that entry into the government, I also started to understand the government side of things about why and what and how things happen. Got a chance to be a part of some important discussions and meetings and contribute some of my analysis and learnings around street vending scheme and street vendors act, particularly with respect to Maharashtra and Mumbai. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's the
So
long version of
it's
this long story. Yeah.
very interesting journey and how you got interested like bit by bit. But I just want you to define street vending for the people. Like how is it defined in the Indian
Hmm.
law or act, so that we know what we are exactly talking about.
Right. I think like the official definition, of course, like I think it's the as per the act, there are certain terminologies, but broadly the way I look at it is it's an act of offering goods or services, right, to the public without having a permanent built up structure, right, semi permanent temporary built up structure, and they are not just at one location. Often there is a category, right, which are there at location, but they also move from one location to another, the moving street vendors, right? So but also it's very important for to distinguish, right, it is not just selling things, right, because they also are a vital component of the urban informal economy that provides essential services and goods to a majority of cities population. So that's how I would broadly say about street vending.
It's also quite interesting because a lot of times the way you characterized street vending as an essential activity in the urban realm, I think it
Hmm.
is. I have only found urban designers or architects define it as such, even though all of us happen to eat or make use of these services on the street
Hmm.
all of the time. But there are very few times where people actually talk about them positively, even though they might be using the services every single day basis. And I find that very weird. Like we kind of just other this whole lot of our fellow citizens when they are literally exercising their right and trying to feed their own family, which I found to be extremely weird. Moving forward, I just want to go directly into the Street Vendors Act. What is the Street Vendors Act?
Yeah, I think before zooming into the act, right, because of course the act came in 2014, but there is a lot of context also before that, right, because street vendors existed for a long time, right. Act of course came in 2014, but then there were a lot of landmark judgments and policies on street vending, right. I remember there was this 1980s, there was Bombay Hawkers Union versus BMC, where the BMC challenged for delegating the unguided power to refuse to grant or renew licenses or hawking. Then it was happening in other cities also. There was Delhi. In Delhi also there was a lot of uh, this debate between whose right it is to vend, how much access they have on public roads and things like that, right? And in from my remembrance, I think in 2001, Government of India announced a task force to draft a policy on street vending, and in 2004 national policy on urban street vendors was launched, but I think in 2009, so if you read, like, I think there's a national policy for street vendors, which is 2009. It was introduced in 2004, but and then it was, I think, in 2009 it was officially, I think, launched as a document, what I you will also see in the public domain. And this national policy, the 2009 policy, really acknowledges street vendors are a vital and legitimate component of the urban retail and distribution system for daily necessities, right? And I think it is important then you start recognizing street vending as an important component, as a defining activity, and not just as a so-called encroachers or nuisance. At least there is some sort of now a legal terminology when the national policy on urban street vendors is launched, and the aim is of course to create that supportive environment for vendors to sustain their livelihoods while simultaneously addressing issues of congestion, maintaining cleanliness, road safety, and a lot of other things, right? Because the policy itself also recognizes the inherent conflict that exists between the needs of the street vendors, the traffic flow. But instead of viewing them as adversaries, it seeks to achieve some sort of a balance. And there are different components to the policy, and it's a longish document, but it highlights things like it talks about legal recognition, that how can one think about formalizing street vending by granting vendors some sort of legal status, and how can it be achieved, how can there be designated vending zones within the urban development plan, thinking about regulation and not elimination, right? Moving away from this whole arbitrary restriction on the number of vendors, it advocates for some sort of a regulation based on nominal fees, permits, and it's a national policy, right? So it's something you need to still think about it. It's not an act yet, right? So it lacks that teeth and that whole enforcement because it's still a policy, like a guiding document. And then I think because a national policy signifies the government's intent, but it lacked the legal force of law. And this led to eventually, after years of advocacy from organizations like NASVI, right, which is National Association of Street Vendors of India, and then that whole landmark Street Vendors Act was passed in 2014. And if you look at the act, it also says in the bracket it's protection of livelihood and regulation of street vending, right? So, and then that act in which you start identifying the more nuances at different points in time, lot of back and forth has gone into it, which again is the most important component of the act, and it mandates local authorities to create the rule, the scheme, and the whole local governance structure, while the act defines that important governance structure, which is the town vending committee. Right now, TVC then becomes the heart. Right, what is TVC? Essentially, it's a town vending committee that includes a representation of street vendors, which is almost 40% of town vending committee is street vendors representatives. Along with that, the town vending committee has bankers, traffic police, NGOs, resident welfare association, and of course the ULB, the high ranking, the municipal commissioners or the chief officer essentially head the town vending committee. So it has a representation of different dimensions of the society. So that became sort of the key precedent, and the TVC then became the most important nodal agency because now it was more a participatory mechanism where there was state representation as well as the 40% street vending representation, and within that 40% also there is a reservation for women street vendors and things like that. Now the act then sets that precedent to think about street vending by creating that structured framework. And then it has things like legal recognition, livelihood protection, how the elected town vending committee then has to designate vending zones, distribute the vending certificates so that there is an official document that defines who they are, where are they vending, and they are officially allowed to vend in a certain time, etc. And the states then have to create those scheme as per the act. And then it also then TVC also then becomes a participatory governance mechanism as per the act, right? And this becomes very important in that inclusive decision making what we often talk about in our urban systems, along with creating a grievance redressal mechanism where which has to be there for dispute resolution. So it's kind of like really like a shared responsibility, right, with roles for central government, state government, urban local body, and then of course the town vending committees, and they have key responsibilities. We'll get into that, but I think broadly this is how the act comes in, which is a great sort of a step forward, which basically leads to sort of trigger across then the states to start now building their own schemes and rules in their respective urban local bodies. So, and it's very interesting that we are talking after many weeks and months of wait. We do this podcast today, and in fact, it is soon, maybe by today evening, maybe just after this podcast gets over, we will be hearing the town vending committees because today, the after the High Court ruling just last week, the town vending committee are to be announced in Mumbai after a long wait, and that's why, in fact, there's this whole excitement now that finally we will have the seven town vending committees, the seven division town vending committees, and one apex town vending committee in Mumbai, which will now begin the process of drafting the scheme, which has been on stay since I think 2017, and that scheme would be drafted, and then that would lead to the next steps of distributing vending certificates and creating those vending zones, hawking zones, the official vending zones and hawking zones. So that bottleneck is sort of a big bottleneck is sort of unleashed, and it's hopefully it's going to create those positive ripple effect. So it's very historic moment in Mumbai's, one of the historic turning points also in Mumbai street vending story, and we are doing this podcast today. So that's just a coincidence. I thought I'll highlight, but we'll get into Mumbai story as well more as we speak here.
I especially was a little pinched in the past month, I would say, because that is when the whole hawker drives started across the MMR region. Immediately, we start getting tagged in a lot of posts online. Ki, the other flower market hawkers are removed. Looks great. Looks like this. People constantly commenting, sharing, and then some people, as usual, hafta badega bhi and all the usual kind of
Mm,
jokes that go around. But the
yeah.
difference that I saw this time is that there genuinely seems like there is intent from the government to clear the streets of hawkers. That I say because I have spoken to a few politicians as well in the past month or so, and one of them mentioned to me that, as we know, a lot of the politicians actually end up spending a bunch of money to employ people on a lot of these hand carts and vendor stalls. So there is a recognition even from the politicians that this thing exists, this market exists, and this is a way
Mm,
to employ people. But the guy was telling to me कि we cleared off the hawkers from the street and we are taking it up at such an extent that I also asked the guys that I have paid to set up their stalls. Ki no, the mayor wants to get rid of these hawkers, and uh, the larger aspect that I don't live in Greater Mumbai. I don't live in BMC jurisdiction. I live in Dombivli. But we, as well at our railway stations, have been seeing this anti-hawker drives and all happen over the past 2 weeks. And I think this is the longest time period that I've seen hawkers being troubled for. I've seen this happen every couple of years, I would say. Yeah, even if one Google searches anti-hawker drive Mumbai something like uses those keywords,
mm,
they will
yeah.
find over 20,000
Oh,
articles over the past 20 years. So it's not like it's not been tried, but I think that is somewhere lawmakers are also not recognizing the fact that has been tried a lot, but without a proper solution, without actually cutting to the core, the meat of the issue, you're not going to be able to solve the problem. It's purely uh, a supply demand socio-economic
mm,
problem, not just physically hawker being present on the location problem. Which is why I just wanted to start with this conversation because
mm,
I had literally been for the past 1 year saying ki we will address hawkers whenever people use it. We will address hawkers. There will be a podcast coming and we'll be discussing all of the things we want to get our perspective on it.
yeah. No, but I think this frustration is very valid, and I think also like it depends also what is your position from where you are voicing this, right? Every, because I think, like I said before, I think there is definitely a huge lack of awareness, because people often, and this is something which I've thought not just in the space of street vending but also in the space of informal housing, right? Like, how does one become an encroacher, and how does one loosely use the word encroacher is also something which needs deeper thinking. Because an encroacher, how it is defined, it's not an overnight thing, and the whole terminology around it, like if you think about it, there is an act which was launched by the government of India, right, 2014, and we are in 2026. So it's almost like more than a decade now since the act has been passed. And there is a certain history and trajectory of each and every state, right, across India,
Yeah,
because street vendors exist. They run a major part of our city, right? Like, I mean, a major part of our everyday grocery and whatever we buy and things we consume comes from street vendors, right? So there is definitely a huge demand and a huge supply. So I mean, I mean, I don't think anyone needs any factual justification on that, right? You just go down your road, or go down the road on Main Street Market, you will see that. So there is, that is definitely established. I think the problem or the challenge lies in the way one uh, tries to look at their own areas and try to make a judgment out of it, right? So often you will often see that there is this whole challenge between people themselves not advocating that street vendors should be there outside their own localities because they want places to walk, run, it has to be clean and certain way. But often those are the very people who will maybe go 500 meters from their house and their buildings, and they will buy from the street vendors because it is more affordable, right? And it is fresh and a lot of things. So I feel there is this, like, this whole nimbism, right? Not in my backyard, right? Till the time my area is clean, it's okay. Then I will fight for other things. And I think that needs to be really shifted, and one has to look at the larger picture of not looking at them as others, especially on a street, because it's also an equal part. They are an equal stakeholder and in equal part of the street. Now that is something which is why this whole regulatory mechanism exists, right? Because it is not about, it's, no one is saying that there should not be, you should take, reclaim the whole space of the pedestrian and then put street vendors. But there has to be a very contextual case by case analysis where there can be an equal division of the spaces, where street vendors also can exist, people can also walk, and there is also smooth traffic flow and things like that. And of course it becomes very complicated the moment you pit one against another, because it is not this, often in our discourse what we see is it's this or that, right? It is not this and that. And I think that shifting from or to and really require that whole behavior shift, not just within our conversation, but also across different stakeholders, be it public, private, government, right? Like at different levels. And the moment this shift happens, the fight and the language and the way we talk about street vending and its connectedness with walkability and our experience of movement on footpaths, it also will shift. Because I also feel like, of course, there is an act, then Maharashtra created its own set of rules and the street vending scheme in 2017. Of course, it had its slow implementation and limited vending spaces, enforcement issues. We all know that, and there has been multiple back and forth where a lot of the town vending committees, it also had its own set of legal set of issues. Now, how much do we know that, and what is the direction of that? What should be the trajectory to really find that balance where there is that harmonious way of looking at equal existence is something not just a spatial or a space level thinking, but it's also a legal side of thinking, right? So it has to be thought from both the dimensions. That there has to be a division of spaces properly, but at the same time one has to look at it from a legal standpoint also. And I think that is where all the whole regulations and what the High Court says, what the government says, what the street vending association says, becomes very important to look at this from those perspectives. And that I feel often is lacking because we only go by what is immediately visible. कह रहे मेरे घर के नीचे encroachers आ गए हैं, which is nuisance, it is creating waste management issues and things like that. But where is the problem? How do you assess the problem? And then for that problem, what is the step-by-step direction you think about? Is something which has to be tackled on a case-by-case basis. And I think that is something where your acts and laws and regulations becomes very important. It's not ad hoc.
Yeah. It's also for the webinar that we did last, I think last year, something late last year. We had, I wanted to check at the Singapore's to see how they have tried to look at this hawker issue. We went through the history of entire history from 1920s, I think, maybe even earlier, 1890s probably. And a lot of the statements made by their politicians, bureaucrats and all seem very strikingly similar to the statements made right now by a lot of people. Like, it's unhygienic, it's chaos,
Hmm.
it's having pedestrians have to walk off the streets, it's dangerous, causes diseases, all the same sorts of statements by the health minister, environment minister and all. But then see them acknowledge at, like, over the years we saw ki okay, pehle their whole thing was that we'll just do drives and make them go away. Then they realized ki oh no, a lot of people are actually consuming this, and we kind of need to acknowledge that it is a real part of urban life in Singapore. And then over the years we saw how drastically they started, first of all, legitimizing their existence, and then building for those. How do we ensure that people's livelihoods are saved? How can the patrons who are eating from them are saved? And in the end, now we see the whole Singapore model of hawkers, or the hawker centers that they have. Now, there is one difference in this, that they are not street vendors; they are inside
Mm,
enclosed hawker center
mm,
that is built, where they have tried to relocate them from the streets. I don't think that will probably be possible to do in Mumbai with our already scarce amount of land. But
mm.
it's nice to see intent from a government in the way Singapore did, and try to solve the problem. The same thing that you were mentioning, that we are not trying to solve the problem. Maybe now we are, with the whole passing of the clearing of the court's judgment, and the town vending committees coming.
Yeah, yeah. No, I just wanted to add also one thing, right? The biggest challenge is also the census, right? Because I think so as per, of course, because of a lot of delays, the number of street vendors, no one knows in Mumbai right now, official number of street vendors. And I think like there is of course that estimated number of vendors is might be around 500,000, almost 5 lakhs. But then even the elections that happened, right? Because there is a sequence, right? So like before I kind of jump into those numbers, I also just for everyone to be on the same page, I wanted to lay out, right? There was this whole catch 22 situation where so there is a town vending committee who has to do the survey, right? And now that's basis that survey, there is a voter list that gets created, and then basis that voter list, you essentially create uh, the official elected town vending committee, basis which then you finalize the street vending scheme and then distribute the licenses, vending certificates, demarcate the street vending zones, etc. Now the challenge here was that the creation of town vending committee, right? So the act says that the town vending committees needs to be created with street vending representation, the 40%, right? But these committees cannot be formed without the survey of the vendors. But at the same time, to have the survey, you need town vending committee. So literally in the court judgments also, I remember reading it's a chicken or egg situation.
Yeah.
And then basis this whole chicken or egg situation, there's this whole like ambiguity. Finally, it was decided that there will be a nominated town vending committee who will basically act as that first. You have to start somewhere, and then that kind of does that. Now, in this whole process, right, since 2014 till now, like talking about Maharashtra, in Maharashtra's case, of course, in 2016, the Maharashtra street vendors rules came, 2017, the street vendor scheme came, and within few months, there was a Bombay High Court scheme stay on the street vending scheme, and which led to multiple years of delay. And then finally, in 2022, there was the government's detailed letter to all the urban local bodies to establish nominated town vending committees, and they will conduct the survey, prepare the detailed process, prepare the voters list, do the elections, and then finalize the elected town vending committee, who will then, what Maharashtra government letter also said was that each urban local body, then the elected town vending committee, each urban local body will prepare their own street vending scheme, so that and that street vending scheme will be consulted with that elected town vending committee and finalized. So it's like Nagpur will have its own street vending scheme, Pune will have its own street vending scheme, Thane will have its own street vending scheme. So that because of, let's say, one street vending scheme that goes into the High Court, because it's a Maharashtra street vending scheme, the whole state gets paralyzed. Because we often tend to think that Mumbai situation is like all the other urban local body situations in Maharashtra, which is not the case because the context is very different in a lot of other cities. Now that became very defining factor, because now each the urban local body is at different stage of this whole process that needs to be done, whereas Mumbai is at this process. But to answer, like coming back to your point, right, one of the biggest challenges is also we are relying on old number. So there was, I think, the old number, I think there was 99,000 approximately vendors that were declared eligible. I think in 2014, or not 20, I think I don't remember the exact survey year, but eventually I think based on certain qualification criterias, around 33,000 voters voted in 2024 to finalize the town vending, for electing the street vending component of town vending committee. And then that again went into stay, and eventually, so you can think about it in this way, that 33,000 vendors voted and the town vending committee are being finalized in 2026. So in past 10 years, probably a lot of those street vendors who were there in that survey might not even be street vendors today. And today's number itself will be like maybe somewhere around 4 lakh, 5 lakh. We don't even know the number. So basically, the data in which we are operating also then becomes an issue, because if you don't know the number, then how will you know how many spaces you need for the street vendors where they would be officially doing the vending activities, right? But of course, during in this whole process of madness, you need to understand that a madness also has to be broken into parts so that you start somewhere. So hopefully I'm really excited myself, and with this hope that now that we have this town vending committee, hopefully, we will have a new street vending scheme that will be consultative by the urban local body and all the elected town vending committee. And of course, then how then that is used, the scheme once it's finalized, how that scheme will lead to those designations of those official pitches and zones, where which will be partially restricting, no restriction zone, fully vending will be allowed. So that is also like now lot of this representation will lead to better sort of voice in the government system, so that the street vendors themselves are an equal component, a legal component of the street. But of course, I mean, it's not easy because Mumbai again becomes a very complicated geography, because each area in Mumbai has its own set of issues. Often, where the vendors need to be located, there might not be enough footfall, and where there is enough footfall of people to buy from vendors, they might not come under the vending zones. Now, how does one really tackle this complicated problem? Does one do it, let's say, from 2 to 4 p.m., it will be a no vending zone? Because I think some contextual, I think I was reading in some areas, I think global context, where there are those specific time demarcations within which certain areas transform into vending zone, and some areas during other times it is not. So can that be some sort of a thinking, right? Because so that there is that informal economy that is intact, there is that economy generating activity which is also respected, while the same time the pedestrian movement is also restricted in a certain way, but at the same time both are allowed to coexist in that one space. Now how does that be translated will be really important to see, because again Mumbai, that's why Mumbai has almost 8 town vending committee. There is 8 division, 7 divisions, 7 TVCs, and then there is one apex TVC.
So these
Because
are divided geographically.
yeah, divisions, yeah,
Okay.
zone
Yeah.
wise, basically. Yeah,
Yeah. That will be very interesting to see what the conversations themselves will end up happening inside these committees would be interesting, because I myself am a geek of meeting notes and minutes of meetings of any kind
yeah.
of government meetings. I had one question to you.
Hmm.
So when we think of town vending zones, what does that really mean? Does it allocate a specific space on a given street, or is it just okay, this street you can vend on this street?
So,
Because
hmm. Yeah, yeah, complete.
because generally when it comes to the Indian Roads Congress guidelines for street vendors, you are supposed to be on a specific part of the given footpath.
Hmm.
You're supposed to be allocated space over there. Most footpaths in Mumbai are not wide enough to really allow for street vending to happen, especially in the suburbs. At least in South Mumbai, you find footpaths wide enough where you can
Hmm.
actually be engaging in that activity without disturbing pedestrian movement.
Right.
Does the town vending policy for the city kind of say where exactly on the street can you engage in the
No,
activity?
yeah, got it. No, so basically, you need to understand that each city's context is different, each state context is different. right? So then an act, we are talking about a national level, right? An act is at a national level. How that act is translated on ground, and that's why you use that act, and each state has to prepare their own schemes rules using that but then again, like I told you, Maharashtra now, because of that change, each city will can prepare its own scheme, because each city's context is also different, right? So there will be some tweaking which will be done. But broadly, what a town vending zone says is that it's basically a specific area or location within the local authorities jurisdiction which is designated for street vending activities. Now, it of course it has to be officially notified. Broadly, it categorizes into three types of vending zones. So one is the restriction-free vending zones. So these are areas where vending is allowed without any restrictions, right, on the number of vendors or timings, provided they hold a vending certificate, which has to be given by the town vending committee, because elected town vending committee. Then there is restricted vending zones. Now, restricted vending zones are areas where vending is permitted but subject to certain conditions, which again will be contextually different, right?
Hmm.
Such as specific hours of operation, a limited number of vendors, or restricted on the types of goods which are sold, and things like that. And then the third category is no vending zones. Now, these are areas where street vending is strictly prohibited, and it can be because of high security, extreme traffic congestion, or it's near essential public infrastructure like hospitals, right, or heritage sites, and things like that. So again, that is something which is a urban local body level decision. So these are like broadly three categories. How these three categories, which, like for example, where will be the no vending zone in Dadar versus in Malad, will be decided in that respective zonal town vending committee in Mumbai's case, and that's how you will have to have that plan in place, right? And what is very important is what is very interesting to see then is that you also need that official number of the number of street vendors in that zone.
Exactly.
Because imagine if you have 100 locations, but you have 500 street vendors. So how do you allocate those 100 locations to 500 street vendors? What is that logic? If you are giving, let's say, if you're giving one pitch to two street vendors, one in the morning and one at night, what is the logic of that? Right? So we also need to think about the whole implementation side of town vending zone, which makes it very complicated if we don't have the official data to deal with. Because then we won't be able to make a mathematical sense of it also. Right? Because urban planning or town vending zone
Need
is a
numbers in any case, not just
yeah,
planning.
exactly. So, and then how are these zones determined? Of course, every local authority must prepare a street vending plan or a town vending plan once in every 5 years, because again, the numbers keep changing. And then there's this whole holding capacity component of it, right? Because zones are designated based on the holding capacity of a particular area, meaning like how many vendors can a street accommodate without obstructing the movement of pedestrians and vehicles. And before any zone is finalized, a survey has to be conducted of all the existing vendors. And the act by law, no street vendor should be evicted until this survey is completed and the certificates are issued. This is what the act says. Now,
This is
rest
the biggest
almost,
irony.
yeah. Yeah. And yeah, there's also the whole preference for natural markets, right? Because the act also encourages recognition of natural markets, like for example, Dadar flower market. So there's a whole heritage angle to it also, right? Where
Yeah,
vendors and buyers have traditionally gathered as vending zones to prevent loss of already established livelihoods. And the TVC has already that inclusive component of 40% representation of street vendors. So, of course, the primary goal of these zones is to have that right to livelihood for street vendors, along with the right of way for the general public, right? So, hence, it's important to for us in our conversation also to consciously move from the model of clearing, evicting, removing to one of management, coexistence, thinking joint responsibility, and then working on case by case basis, which I feel often is lacking in lot of conversations which I've seen at different points when it comes to pedestrianization.
exactly. I also am wondering what will happen to the Bombay High Court rule, which says the 150 meters of any railway stations can't be a vending zone. When we think of urban planning, when we think of urban design, the thing we know that is the railway stations is a very high footfall location where it's the highest demand
Hmm.
location in any uh, neighborhood of Mumbai, and that is where naturally a lot of street vendors will want to be at. but because of the same reason of high footfall and high traffic, it's also very congested. And Bombay High Court has made a judgment about not vending, but it is practically unenforceable because you have to constantly just keep clearing them out, keep clearing them out. In against the fact that you have said that you're not supposed to clear them out until this vending committee is actually set up, zones are allocated properly.
Yeah.
And also the numbers thing that you mentioned, that we need to have numbers. It's such a no-brainer that you need numbers to actually see. Like, you don't even know your enemy at this point. The chaos that it is creating is the enemy in this case, I would say.
Hmm.
Even if we look at the private market, right now there are multiple analysts like Knight Frank or JLL who are looking at, okay, Mumbai mein how much is the grade A office space available? How much is the grade B office space available? What are the market trends and how much more space would we require? And
Yeah.
on the basis of that, the private sector is actually building these office spaces and expanding the footprint. We simply don't have the same thing happening in Mumbai. We don't have numbers for actually ठीक है मुंबई में कितने hawkers है,
Hmm.
because we don't know how many hawkers are present or what kinds of activities are being engaged in. Like flower cart, flower vendor will require much less space compared to like a shoe vendor, या फिर vegetable vendor will have a much more compact area compared to a Chinese food uh,
Hmm.
vendor. And we don't have these numbers, so we don't know how much space to allocate, where to allocate these space, and if, like for example, the way you mentioned that there are only 100 spaces in a given neighborhood, so what to do about the rest of the 400 hawkers? We don't even know. Okay, 400 hai, we don't even know that number. So maybe you could allocate them like a station adjacent to highly accessible market where they can be moved into, which has enough decent footfall, and solve that problem. कि okay, 100 I allocated space on the footpath. Rest of the 400 can go into a market which is very highly accessible.
Yeah.
But yeah, we are not starting.
Yeah. No, I think also like just adding to this, the challenge also becomes of how does one look at street vending markets, right? Because the best street vending markets in India, and I'm sure in a lot of other contexts, are the ones that operate on the ground floor, or just on the ground, right? It's because you move from one point to another, you buy, and it's that's how we have seen the best markets operate. Now, imagining a five-storied street vending market is something. How will it really function in reality, right? Like if I have to go
Probably
to
not
buy,
well.
yeah, because if I have to go to buy tomatoes on third floor, uh, uh, from a street vendor, then there is no difference between, let's say, a multi-utility sort of a market of sorts, and versus a street vending sort of an area. So I think there is that part of things, right? How will it practically look like? And then the added layer that Mumbai does not have space enough for pedestrians to walk, for parking, for movement of vehicles, and then ये सब chaos में where do you even put street vendors, right? So then there is that whole another shift, behavior shift, and that spatial management becomes very important, because this conflict between the right of way for pedestrians and the right to livelihood for vendors in Mumbai is a one of the most complex space level challenge in Indian urbanism, I feel. Not just in our city, but across in and lot of other cities also. But Mumbai, particularly, it's very evident, right? So how do we move past eviction drives towards shifting from a more regulatory mindset to a design and management approach? Also, is very important, right? This whole multi-utility zone, right? Someone also asked the question in one of the questions you had shared, right? Instead of keeping vending as an encroachment on footpath, there is also a lot of thinking around multi-utility zone where you reclaim some dead space between the walking path and the motorable road to create a dedicated 1 meter wide vending space. Right? How do we think about infrastructure synergy, where we design cheap furniture that doubles as vending kiosks during the day, and seating or lighting at night. So I think like probably some of those can be some of the thoughts, and there has to be some pilots that need to be done, which then can be We can see the pros and cons of those pilots, and that can be replicable in other areas. Then what are the permeable boundaries, right? Can you use bollards or textured flooring to clearly demarcate the walking lane from the vending lane that prevents that spillover onto the main thoroughfare, right? So that can be some other sort of a thought process. And of course, like adding the another layer of climate, right? Because of course that is something which is it's no more a hoax, as some people might call it, right? It's a reality on an everyday basis. And of course, it disproportionately affects the people who are actually out in the sun or feasting on a day-to-day basis, right? It affects the most marginalized sections disproportionately. So then, how can we think about integrating more cooler and functional spaces also within that system?
This
That
this
can be the
really
reality.
this really is reminding me of the research and the webinar that I did for the Singapore hawker markets, because
Mm,
over the years, so I think the first hawker market came in Singapore around, I think, 1975, if I'm not wrong. And over the years, so it's run by the Environment Ministry in Singapore. All of the 200, I think 225 or 125, something like that. I don't remember exactly. I think 125. There are 125 hawker centers across Singapore, and each and every market is iteratively improved using the learnings that they had from the previous market. Like modern day, they know exactly what human psychology to play to. For example, they change the seating style, the style of benches. Like, do people like round tables more, or do they like rectangle tables more? How much space should be there between the seat and the table? Lately, they have started adding a centralized system for like ventilation system for all of the fume exhaust coming from the kitchens that are cooking food inside these vending spaces. They don't use air conditioning at a lot of these spaces, so how to passively cool the entire vending space, how to make use of more local materials, and constantly iterative improvements are happening in this space. And I really love uh, the way you were mentioning the climate angle of this and how to tackle that. I I think I generally see the challenge like it's a major challenge, yes, but I think it's 100% solvable. I don't think it's very it's unsolvable in Mumbai, especially with the amount of money we have, like our municipal budget. Like you're mentioning that so markets maybe work the best at the ground level. I think it's possible to make them work at least three, three to four levels. I'll try to describe how. Let's just imagine we are at maybe Borivali station. I have just got off a train,
mm,
and I need to climb the football bridge to get at the first level. Okay, I get onto the Borivali deck, railway deck, and then there is a huge football bridge directly connecting it to the nearby market, which itself is a three-story structure, two floors above the ground, one floor underground. So at that level, I as a commuter have not really had to climb any extra floors. I'm just walking into the space. Maybe I live at a place which is on the other side, and the market just happens to fall in the
mm,
walking in my during my walk. So I enjoy walking through the market. So I just walk through it, impulsively end up buying something. Like we see a lot of metro stations, especially on the line one Ghatkopar to Versova line. You see this non-fare box revenue concept
mm,
coming up to make a lot of money, and Ghatkopar station literally has vendors. Like a lot of the stalls are literally vendors. They are not
mm,
even the Jumbo Kings or the McDonald burgers. They are literally phone ka case or keychains and all of that stuff, and it has
mm,
literally come out of a market based demand. They are able to afford to buy space over there. So I think we can be designing for it and solving these problems. It is very much possible. It might be expensive, it might require a lot of talent. I don't think we lack either of those things in Mumbai, and I feel it's a very much solvable problem that we should genuinely want to solve. Like daily, what the new figure is, what, 1 crore plus 1.1 crore people using the railways every day.
mhm,
That's crazy. Like so many people are getting in and out of these railway stations. We can be elevating. the experience of so many people on a daily basis. It's just such a low hanging fruit for any politician to improve lives of so many
Yeah.
people, and the hawkers, not just commuters who are passing through these places. Like, why does a hawker have to sit in a hot 43-degree
Hmm.
centigrade summer heat when they can be accommodated in a very nice, well designed, eternal space?
Yeah. No, I think there definitely there has to be like multi-level thinking and the whole from the whole climate angle, thinking about the permeability, right? Can vending zones be rather than on concrete? Can it be on more porous blocks because often concrete traps heat, which and that's one of the main spaces. If you're spending too much time there, so you will end up feeling the impact much more, right? And then also the whole permeability, like it allows during the monsoons, it allows that runoff water to infiltrate into the ground rather than pooling on the street, which then might damage the goods of street vendors and things like that. So thinking about those becomes very important. Then of course the shade, right? Having shade is extremely critical, right? Having some sort of standardizing this vendor stalls in some way wherever it's possible, the space allows it, with lightweight or some sort of fabric or green roofs that can mitigate the heat. So that then becomes very important as well, which can also be temporal in nature, so that it can be collapsible during evacuation during some emergencies and things like that, right? So it also allows for that flexibility while providing those shade canopies during those peak hours of heat and things like that. So I think there can be definitely, and there is a huge conversation also going on even at global level, where how street vendors and climate impacts on street vending happens, and how can one think about it is something which is happening also in some context in India. I know some people who are doing that. So that's definitely like one thing that really needs some sort of pilots and doing it, so that that can set some precedent for other areas to also start building on those examples, which I feel really has, like Mumbai definitely, it has the potential to try to locate some areas where some pilots can be done for sure. So yeah.
Yeah, we had been talking to, like, I think this is something that all of the urban designers will would have heard. A lot of times politicians say कि ये हम लोग हॉकर निकालते हैं तो वो वापस आ जाते हैं. Can you do some design solution to keep
Hmm.
the hawkers away? Which is such a weird task to want to achieve.
Yeah.
But like, I had tried to convince one of these politicians by showing them the market economics of it. Like, I had said, ki, look at Nariman Point. It's a CBD in Mumbai. If you go to the Free Press Journal Street, the entire lane is covered with hawkers, and it's an extremely vibrant space during the afternoon where you can go and eat the famous Bombay sandwich, all sorts of Chinese. You
Hmm.
can have chaat, all of
Yeah.
that stuff. Same at Churchgate. If you go to the Churchgate Khau Gully, you will have it near Bombay Hospital. The same kind of a street vending activity happens. If you go to Flora Fountain, the whole Horniman Circle area, Kala Ghoda area, you will see a bunch of hawkers on MG Road. You go to
Yeah.
Andheri, again Andheri East, the inform like a unorganic kind of a CBD that has developed in the city. Again, you will
Yeah.
find street vending. You go to the Godrej compound at Vikroli, outside high value offices, you will find a lot of street vending activity happening because the demand is there. Most of the people simply cannot be affording the highly expensive food that is served at a lot
Hmm.
of the internal canteens, and the
Yeah.
canteens simply don't have the capacity as well. If there are 5,000 employees, there is barely capacity for 200 an hour. So a lot of it ends up coming onto the streets. And like, when we think of CBDs, CBDs are generally mostly planned. Like Nariman Point was planned, BKC was planned, CBD Velapur was planned, Airoli was planned, Malad Mindspace area has been planned, Andheri, MIDC and SEEPs both are planned. The rest of the things that have mushroomed around it has not been, but still, like, there is a floating population every day of over 2 to 3 lakh people coming in. They're going to have to need to eat somewhere. So it has to be the municipality's job to
Yeah.
identify where can we be building these spaces where people can eat, and ensure that the food is hygienic over there. Like, again, when I come to hygienic point, I remember the Singapore's rating system, where they have a A to D rating for the cleanliness levels of their stalls, and they each of the stalls present in each of the hawker centers are have a rating displayed on the wall, and 99% of the vendors have a rating of B plus in
Mm,
Singapore, and 95% are A rated. So there they have a system for checking what kind of water is used for cooking, what kind of oil is used for cooking, and
mm,
there are constant surveys. I think every 3 years there is a survey done for it. And also, a lot of the complaints that people have is कि okay, ये street vendors cause a lot of litter. There is garbage all around these vending activities. That has been solved again in the Singapore context, because they have created a centralized dishwashing facility. So like a mall food court, you go, you buy, you get some food from them, and the trays go into the centralized management system, and then it goes back to all of the restaurants which are within the food court. That the same thing happens at the highway food plazas that we have, the road highway side plazas we find on any expressway when you're
mm.
traveling in Mumbai, and that has not been replicated, or a form of that has not been replicated in our cities. Hopefully, as we move ahead, that will happen a
Yeah.
lot more as we as things mutate, and we try to find problems and see problems and try to solve those problems.
Yeah. And I think town vending plans and how they are imagined is something which will be very important to see, and how there might be folks who might want to come in and pitch some designs. And but there is also like this whole policy angle of things, and then there is the whole design and management aspect of things, right? So both have to talk to each other, and try to kind of build some precedent by zooming in into some location, getting the funding and trying to demonstrate, which can maybe lead to that doing, learning by doing sort of a approach, rather than just trying to uh, test it in theory.
Yeah, I have an anecdotal example from Dombivli. Like,
Mm,
we talk about testing by doing instead of the
mm,
theoretical work. This is something which has organically formed this kind of a thing in Dombivli. So on Manpada Road in Dombivli, it must be 3.5, 4 kilometers road from the railway station, I think, up to the Kalyan Shield Road. And I think from the railway station up to Shivaji Udyog Nagar, which is I think midway point for the road, you can walk consistently on the footpath. You won't have to step off the footpath because of a hawker or any other problem. Even the shops don't put up their stuff outside onto the footpath for the most part. Like, there are a few couple of shops I can remember which do it, but most of them don't do it. And why is that? Like, where are the street vendors in it? It's not like there are no street vendors on that. There are street vendors on Marpada Road. There are a bunch of those. But what has ended up happening is that they have set up their shop uh, on the shoulder portion of the footpath. It's not onto the footpath. So at some places there are vehicles parked, and on some places there are hawker stalls. So most of the people walking can just simply keep on walking, and this has not come through any sort of planning,
mm,
larger level ideation, or anything. It's just come out because there is a lot of people walking on that footpath. So vendors don't want to kind of disturb that balance, and the shopkeepers don't see a problem because the vendors are also kind of attracting
mm.
are serving their customers. Like, you go into afternoon, buy a sari for a during a hot afternoon, you get out and you find a nice fruit shop, you buy those fruits. So it's a nice kind of a coexistence that you see. A lot of that you have we have also seen at Mahavir Nagar, which has been the recent battleground for street vendors activity, especially after the some violent clashes broke out, I think, last month. And we had heard that once the BMC started BMC started doing these eviction drives, a lot of the vendors simply started giving money to whatever shop is present right over there, and use that small 4 feet space between their door and the footpath.
Hmm.
So there is just such high demand that hawkers are starting to kind of make these hawkers and people in general are trying to uh, get into these novel ideas of placing it, and
Yeah.
it's a whole market economy that the BMC itself can also capitalize on. Like, why not do this whole neoliberal way of trying to solve the problem and
Hmm.
create markets where you have the street vendors pay a small amount of fee, which can then go to manage the market, manage the cleanliness of the market or the street, and
Yeah.
assign a person who can also regulate it properly throughout the day, or do a twice a day cleaning of the market so that whatever litter is being generated, it
Yeah.
does not create problems.
Yeah, it's like I mean, I always feel like wherever the problem is not solved by the local government, state, or wherever you want, who is responsible for solving the problem, be it in the informal housing space, be it in the street vending space, people are genius enough to figure their way out, because they also know that they are catering to some demand. So the supply side of things also automatically come up, right? For example, like similar thing, right? There's a stall near my house where there is proper a grocery store with a lot of things, and then on the morning they just rent out that space for 4 hours to a small tuppeny kind of a movable cart. That's only for morning 6 to 10, because that ends up
Like
providing the
idli or
breakfast,
something.
right? So I think that's a very common thing phenomenon you see in lot of places. And to think about a bigger scale, Manik Chowk in Ahmedabad is one of the biggest examples, where that whole space completely transforms. It's different during the morning, during the afternoon, and during the late night, because in the afternoon it is a one of the most bustling market of clothes, of jewelers, and things like that. So like Zaveri Bazaar version basically in Ahmedabad, and Manek Chowk in the old city of Ahmedabad. And as the day ends, the shops shut down, and there are lines which are there, which are the same electricity lines, which slowly it starts proliferating with all the food carts, vendors in that area, and that whole parking lot in the morning and afternoon completely transform into an eating zone. So that space completely transforms, and the whole nature of whom it caters to also then completely expands, catering to different kind of public. So I feel there are ways, there are examples which are inherently there within our cities, within our context. The best examples are also a lot of natural markets, which are the old markets that have been existed for a long time in our culture, and that itself can serve as a huge inspiration of how we want to reimagine today the street vending zones, apart from, of course, the whole policy and regulatory side of things. So I think, yeah, things are also there, and things will also need to be innovated. Yeah.
Okay. Are there other international precedents? Like, how have some other countries tried to solve this problem? Do we have some similar
Hmm.
ways? Like, probably, obviously, India is going to be a very specific and very different beast compared to most other countries. But like, does Southeast Asia somewhere, or maybe the Middle East, or
Hmm.
Turkey, maybe. I think Turkey's bazaars are something fairly similar to Mumbai's bazaars as well. It's an old
Yeah.
civilization, and you have the same dense urbanism.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm not fully sure about a lot of India international examples. Immediately, they don't come to my mind, but I'm sure I've seen that. I've When I was in Istanbul, I remember seeing those near the Hagia Sophia Mosque. It was very well organized, and there was restrooms, and there was a proper waste management angle of things also, which was very well defined. along with the movement aspect, the sitting area, the street furniture. So it was quite a well integrated market.
I
I
think
think.
that is also probably the oldest market in the world, if I'm not wrong. I remember
Okay,
reading something about it.
okay,
So,
I'm not sure. But also in Bangkok, if I'm not wrong, the Bangkok Metropolitan Administration, or whatever the terminology is, they move towards this whole organized vending hours. That whole what vending hours are suitable during what time, where certain streets are vendors only during specific times. And I think that also works out really well then, because then you are kind of allowing coexistence by an axis of time, depending on what is relevant at what time types. And
hmm,
in but in India also, like I think Odisha, I think Bhubaneswar, there are examples where there are organized street kiosks that have become a part of uh, the implementation of Street Vendors Act of sorts. And I'm not fully sure about the latest status, but I read somewhere in some news pieces and things. So I've not gone personally to see them. But yeah, I think there are more examples, but it's not coming in my head right now.
I mean, in Mumbai, there is already a layer of that present. Like we know these R.A. Sarita stalls and the
Yeah,
telephone booths, which have been converted into cigarette
correct.
chapparis and all, which are present. The problem is that we have not expanded and scaled it according to the
Yeah.
demand. That as we close, I want to ask you is your what is a book you would recommend?
I think in this context and in general, I feel this book by Jane Jacobs, who is famously coined this "Eyes on Street."
Yeah,
This death and life of great American cities is something. It's like that sort of a Bible I keep going back to because it's extremely powerful, very relevant. It's one of the magnum opus by Jane Jacobs, and also like so much of her life she has dedicated to the whole street and the community led movement. And I think in vendors context, it's all the more interesting because when the street vendors are eyes on the street, right? I mean, and they are the ones who make a city safe and vibrant. So that's one thing which one book I'll highly recommend. And in fact, I keep going back and I keep learning new things. Uh, and I think also on the close, I just want to mention one important point is like how do we? It's very important. A point I really want to drive home is how do we stop consciously looking at street vendors as encroachers and start seeing them as on micro entrepreneurs, as urban partners, or whatever you want to call it, right? But to because that helps us shift the lens from traffic obstruction to more like a value added service sort of approach, right? And I mean that's extremely important because I mean, the next time like if anyone who's listening, who will be listening to this, you feel frustrated by a narrow sidewalk, try to distinguish between the person and the infrastructure because the vendor isn't the problem. It's
yeah,
the lack of often the inclusive street design, like a multi utility zone and things like that, often is the larger problem at hand. Then, of course, the whole policy regulation angle, right? So, it is not the person, and then when we advocate for better footpaths, we should be asking then for space for both, for walking and vending, rather than asking for the removal of the very people who are actually making our streets also safe and convenient and affordable and accessible to many. Right? So it's important to think about this street vending and street vendors within the larger context and not just something which is like your immediate problem to hata do types, you know. So I think that's something which I want to really stress on more than anything else.
yeah. Before closing, I just want to mention this one anecdote from 2023 when we had hosted our fifth community walk in Ghatkopar. There was this one person,
Hmm.
this one lady who had joined us, and she had lived for a few years in London. And
Hmm.
what she said was fascinating to me. She said that she didn't feel safe in London at night
Hmm.
as compared to Mumbai, primarily because London streets at
Hmm.
night are extremely
Yeah.
empty and deserted. And in Mumbai, the moment she gets out of the railway stations, there are still a lot of
Hmm.
hawkers, people buying the dabeli pav and anda pav,
Yeah.
whatever. And you have a cup of coffee present at the railway station at whatever hour you go to at.
Hmm.
And that is when the inherent good part of the good or the value of vendors is
Hmm.
visible, clearly visible when nothing else is open,
Yeah.
and this poor guy has put up his stall and is feeding 5-10 people at the stall itself, and then feeding
Hmm.
another set of people at his home for whom he is struggling doing this business overall for him.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's a nice close to the conversation that we
Yeah.
have. I really loved having you over for this chat. I would love to have you again in the
Sure.
future
Yeah.
and discuss more deeply on
Yeah.
how today's meeting goes out and what happens to this whole
Sure.
street vendors policy in Mumbai and Mumbai, Maharashtra, India in general. But
Yeah.
yeah, thanks a lot for joining us for the podcast. Really
Yeah.
loved.
I know. Thanks for inviting, and I think it's good for me also to kind of keep reflecting on and trying to kind of uh keep thinking about this topic more and more, because it's not an easy topic to solve, but it's a very important thing to keep building towards.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Nice to have you
Yeah.
again.